Okay, so moving on to the next team in the Big Ten that we will be going over. This is going to be the team that I have finishing in 10th place, and that would be Richard Pitino and his Minnesota Golden Gophers. And I think it's interesting with this Minnesota team because I feel like last year, if Minnesota was not in the Big Ten, they would have been a team that got a little more national attention. And more specifically, Daniel Oturu would have been a player that got some more national attention because Minnesota was a solid squad last year. It's just they played in such a deep league, and I feel like it's going to be a little bit of a similar case this year. But I'll say it right off the bat. I really like the way this roster is constructed right now, and I will give Richard Pitino credit for that. I've been a guy that over the last couple of years that has been a little skeptical over Rich Pitino and the potential direction of this Minnesota program. I'll never forget, a couple years ago, they brought back a whole really good group of players with Nate Mason and Reggie Lynch and Jordan Murphy, and that season turned around really, really quickly when Reggie Lynch was suspended for the rest of the season, and then the rest is history. But when you look at this Minnesota team, right, I really like the way they're built because they have a couple guys that could do everything. You start off with Marcus Carr, the 6'2 redshirt junior at point guard. He averaged 15.4 points per game, 5.3 rebounds per game, 6.6 assists per game, and about 1 full steal per game. So he's a guy that could do so many different things on a basketball court, and I do think he's an all Big Ten caliber player. He's that good. They also bring back Gabe Kalsher, the 6'4 junior, who averaged 11.6 points per game and about 3 rebounds per game. He is one of the more consistent and best shooters in all of college basketball, and I do think if you're someone that hasn't necessarily watched a lot of Minnesota basketball, you should see a guy like Gabe Kalsher play because you really appreciate just how consistent he is as a knockdown shooter. Now, I mentioned Daniel Oturu and how possibly that could be a very big loss, but all hope is not lost for this Minnesota team because they actually bring in one of the best grad transfers on the market in Liam Robbins, the 7-foot junior who averaged 14 points and 7 rebounds a game at Drake last year. I really liked what he was able to do, and he provides Minnesota also with that really good quality size, and that wasn't the only grad transfer they decided to pick up. They picked up Brandon Johnson, the 6'8 redshirt senior who played at Western Michigan. I believe he'll be a really good, effective plug-and-play guy for this Minnesota Golden Gophers team. He averaged 15.4 points per game last year and about 8 rebounds per game, even though both Johnson and Robbins are coming from mid-major leagues, and it's obviously going to be a step up in competition playing in the Big Ten. I do think both those guys are suited well to do that because it's not like they were playing in the MEAC or some, really bad league. They were playing in the MAC and the Missouri Valley, and those are two of the better mid-major leagues. I think Liam Robbins would have been a guy that, if he would have returned to Drake, would have been in that Missouri Valley Player of the Year conversation with guys like A.J. Green of Northern Iowa and Cameron Krutwig of Loyola Chicago. So I think Robbins is going to be a guy that's really effective for this Minnesota Golden Gopher team. And then the third transfer they bring in is Booth Gatch from Utah. If you listen to the Pac-12 preview podcast edition of the Zach Curl Sports Podcast, I spoke a lot about how good I think Utah is going to be and how high I am on them, and that's without Booth Gatch. And Gatch is a player that has been really productive throughout his career at Utah, and he's from Minnesota. So with this transfer, he decides to come home, and I do think with all of those guys, Richard Pitino deserves credit for bringing them in. You also look at the bench, and there are a lot of guys that have potential, but not a lot of really established guys that you definitely know what you're getting from. You start off with Eric Curry, who at one point in his career looked like to be a very promising young player. Unfortunately, injuries have really derailed that. Last season, he averaged about 4 points and 3 rebounds a game as a junior. At 6'9", I feel like I would be a little bit surprised if he made a significant impact, but you never know. They also bring in Jamal Mashburn Jr., the 6'2 freshman guard. I think he could be a guy that could play a big-time role, for this Utah team. And then they bring in 2 guys that played bench minutes sparingly last year in Trey Williams and Isaiah Enan. I think it's reasonable, if you're a Minnesota fan, to see both of those guys improve a little bit. So I understand that when you look at my Big Ten rankings, right, you're going to see, wow, I have Minnesota finishing in 10th place. That must mean I'm not very high on them. No, it's actually quite the opposite, because I think in this Big Ten, right, in terms of the depth, you have to be really good to be in ninth place or 10th place or even just be in NCAA tournament contention to begin with. So with that being said, I do think that Minnesota and this year is really big because they have the potential to be really good and win. But the reason why I'm going to have them 10th, which compared to some of the other contenders is a little low, it's because Richard Pitino, as good as a job as he did assembling this roster, and keep in mind, I just complimented him for that. I'm just not 100% sure if I trust him as a effective coach to get the job done. Now, he did a good job last year. I think you can make the argument that Minnesota overachieved. And then 2 years ago, he won an NCAA tournament game, which was really good. That was a game against Louisville, which, if you remember, not necessarily a lot of people expected them to win. So I think he deserves credit for that. It's just at the same time, can he do enough with this team to get the job done going forward? And this is going to be probably a big year for Minnesota because Marcus Carr most likely is going to be gone after this year. Maybe you return Kalsher, Gotch, and Carr, but if Gotch pops, I wouldn't be shocked to see him maybe move on, go to the NBA. Kalsher is a guy that's really consistent. So with Johnson leaving and then that's it, maybe Minnesota just runs the whole group back of Carr, Kalsher, Gotch, and Robbins. Maybe that's the case. But if you're a Gopher fan, I'd be focusing on this year and just how good this team could possibly be. Because I think Richard Pitino is a coach that he's done a good job bringing in talent. He just hasn't always gotten the job done in terms of turning that talent into wins. One other player I really wanted to talk about for Minnesota is Trey Williams. I think he's a really bad matchup for a lot of teams because he shot 28% from the floor during his freshman year, 27% from three, and I totally understand that you're going to see those numbers and not feel great about it, but he has really good size and he has a really good physical tools on the wing, I believe, to succeed with this Minnesota Gophers team. They also bring back Jarvis Omersa, so clearly there is a lot of talent on this Minnesota Golden Gopher team. I just think they're really going to have to take advantage of it, and Richard Pitino is really going to have to coach effectively because if not, I think this Gopher team in this tough of a Big Ten could be in trouble. We've seen a lot of Minnesota teams in the past bring back just a significant amount of talent and just bust. If you're a Gopher fan, you obviously really hope that doesn't happen. I don't think with this team it will, but playing in the Big Ten is tough. You know, you're facing Purdue on the road. You're facing Michigan on the road. You're facing Maryland on the road. Those are not easy games at all. And I think Minnesota has enough talent to be pretty good. I think they are going to barely make the NCAA tournament by a fringe, but it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. And I feel like they may be in a tough spot going forward because of the bubble and just how tough of a league the Big Ten is. But if you tell me, Zach, is Minnesota in or out? I'll say in, just because of the talent and the job Rich Pitino done assembling the roster.